The old blueprints arrived the same week the magnolia tree split in half. The storm hadn't been cruel, just one of those slow swirling southern tantrums that drag their feet over old towns, wetting porches and whispering down unshingled roofs. But something in its lazy violence had reached down and cracked the tree right at the heart, peeling it apart like a ribcage. In the morning, when Joel walked across the lawn still dotted with broken blooms, he saw the pale pulp of the tree's center and felt an ache he couldn't name. 2 days later, the blueprints came. Rolled tightly in a canister, the color of rusted brass, wrapped in oilskin that smelled faintly of mildew and tobacco, no return address, only a card, handwritten in his father's precise mechanical lettering. For your eyes, if ever you wonder. Joel had not been wondering, not actively anyway. He had spent most of the past 15 years forgetting his father's voice, not because he didn't care, but because memory made things too sharp to touch. He kept a polite shrine, a framed photo in the study, a copy of his father's last published article on spatial philosophy, and a wooden drafting tool that no longer adjusted, things that didn't move, didn't speak, didn't accuse. His father had been an architect, not famous, but deeply precise, revered in certain circles for his obsession with symmetry and human integrated design. Joel remembered the way he talked about buildings, as if they were living creatures deserving reverence and control. He spoke of thresholds like arteries, ceilings like thoughts, rooms were moral decisions, a foyer was forgiveness, a hallway regret. The estate he left behind wasn't much, a modest house with too many books and no footprints in the carpet. A few of his awards yellowed newspaper clippings, and this final gift, a house that had never been built. Joel unrolled the blueprints on his dining room table, pushing aside unpaid bills and a bowl of bruised peaches. The paper crinkled with the sound of a hushed cathedral. At first, it looked like any of his father's designs, angular, elegant, obsessive in detail. But as he traced the hallways with his fingers, he noticed something unusual. The house was enormous, unreasonably so. 47 rooms, multiple wings, corridors that doubled back on themselves, alcoves with no clear function, staircases that rose and fell without obvious necessity. A room labeled Antechamber of Silence, another marked simply R. There were dozens of measurements, some annotated in his father's shorthand, sufficient for inward turning, or light must never reach this corner. Joel sat back in his chair, heart slowing to a still beat. This wasn't just a house, it was a labyrinth, not built for living, but for being seen. He couldn't recall any client associated with a project like this. No articles, no commissions. He combed through his father's old journals, the firm's correspondence, even the university archives where his father once lectured. Nothing. And so the question planted itself. Who was this for? He built the first room out of balsa wood and cardstock on a rainy Saturday, more out of curiosity than sentiment. The model sat heavy on the workbench, absurdly grand for a space labeled vestibule of consideration. As he glued the walls into place, he noticed something beneath one panel. A faint pencil sketch in the blueprint margins, a boy no older than 8, sitting in a windowless square. Joel stared at it for a long time. His own name was scribbled underneath. What sort of man designs a room like that for his child? He didn't stop after the first room. He couldn't. Every corner he reconstructed unearthed something more intimate, more haunted. A bath with a mirror facing another mirror, arranged so the reflections created an infinite corridor of staring selves. A library with false shelves. A bedroom with 2 doors but no bed. His father, who once described vulnerability as a miscalculation of form, had left behind a temple to his own broken arithmetic. Outside, the magnolia tree blackened with rot. Inside, Joel began measuring wood for the Hall of Reverent Delay. The house was never built, not in brick and stone, but inside this miniature resurrection, it had always existed, not as a place to live, but as a place to hide what could not be said aloud. He had inherited not a home, but a confession made in inches. The second blueprint tube arrived in early October, just as the mold crept under the baseboards. Joel had been working late into the nights, hands dry with glue and X-Acto scars, sanding down slivers of wood to recreate a staircase that appeared to ascend toward nothing, a floating stair, unanchored, dreamlike. He called it the vertical vanishing, though his father had labeled it simply ascent, conditional. He was nearly through with the second wing of the model, the north-facing rooms that no longer had corresponding compass bearings, when the second tube arrived, this time hand-delivered by a courier who offered no explanation and left before Joel could ask a single question. This blueprint wasn't rolled, but folded, as though it had been used, studied, perhaps abandoned in frustration. The paper bore creases like an old man's face. This one was different. Instead of floor plans, it held sectional views, cuts into the house, revealing its inner organs, as though his father had begun dissecting the thing before it was even real. It was in these anatomical sketches that Joel found the first clear confession. Drawn across the spine of one internal wall was a phrase, etched in graphite so fine he had to magnify it. "The corridor bends so I won't be seen leaving." Not a note for construction. A whisper. He traced the corridor's line with the edge of a pin, noting the way it curled like a spine, ending in a small closet marked emergency retreat. His father, the man who once designed city plazas around the notion of radical transparency, the same man who demanded open windows, shared sightlines, who equated privacy with shame, had secretly drawn a place to disappear. Joel sat with that discomfort for a long time. It wasn't the idea of the escape route that haunted him. It was the possibility that his father had spent years building this house, not for anyone to enter, but to never be found inside it at all. He continued building, room by room, like a mourner, reassembling a ruined church with matchsticks. In the evenings, the model sat under a single bulb, casting long shadows on the work table. Each new room added volume to a silence he hadn't known he'd been carrying. He remembered the way his father used to measure him, not in words of affection, but in subtle nods and quiet inspections. A correct answer earned a glance. A question answered with vulnerability earned nothing. His father spoke love in design, in discipline, but the syntax was so cold, Joel never learned to read it. Then came the night Joel uncovered the first anomaly in the blueprint's dimensions, a hallway that shouldn't fit, mathematically, between the two rooms it connected. He measured it 4 times. It wasn't a mistake, it was an impossible space, 4 feet too long. He reconstructed it in the model, thinking maybe he'd discover the error as he went. But as the hallway came into shape, Joel noticed the central panel, the wall section between the 4th and 5th floorboards, was double thick. He pried the balsa wood apart and found, inside the model wall, a tiny folded scrap of paper, not aged, placed there recently. On it, in his father's hand, "You looked like your mother when you cried. I didn't know what to do with that." Joel dropped the note. His hands trembled. That admission, so personal, so uncharacteristically raw, hit like a blow to the ribs. His father had built a space to hide his inability to witness pain, even in his own child. Joel stared at the model, the hallway he had built from nothing but paper and pain, and realized something awful and profound. The house wasn't unfinished, it was unspoken. This wasn't architecture, it was absolution by other means. The rooms had never been meant to hold people, only silence, only fear, only the memory of a man who had loved his son so deeply he could only express it through floor plans no one would ever read, except now, the one left behind. Joel touched the tiny door to the antechamber of silence, and this time, it opened. Inside was a miniature chair, and on it, carved so faintly he had to tilt it toward the light. One word: listen. He began to speak aloud to the house. Not in the clumsy theater of childhood, not like when he used to whisper to closets or bargain with the shadows that spilled under the door. No, these were not games, this was dialogue, confession, pleading. The model, laid out across the long oak table, became a kind of altar, a reliquary of withheld intentions. "Why didn't you tell me?" Joel asked one night, staring into the miniature replica of what the blueprint named the Deliberation Gallery, a long corridor of angled mirrors. He had just finished placing the last reflective panel, their silvery insides taken from shattered compact mirrors and cut with a surgeon's care. In those jagged surfaces, Joel saw his own face sliced into multiples. Expressions he didn't recognize, frowns he hadn't known were living in him, a tension that seemed older than his bones. He was unraveling, but the unraveling had order, like a lace being unthreaded along its pattern. The more rooms he built, the more he realized how deeply his father's pride had been misnamed. It wasn't arrogance that built this house. Not fully. It was fear made eloquent. His father had worshipped precision because feelings could not be drawn to scale. He had traded hugs for harmony, affection for angles. The pride had come after. The pride was what hardened when the love could not come through. Joel tried to remember the last time his father touched him. Not a handshake, not a correction of posture, but a genuine gesture, hand on shoulder, arm around the back. The memory was brittle, maybe 10 years old, maybe younger. As he carved the doorway to the observation chamber, he cut his thumb. Blood dotted the miniature floorboards, a crimson bloom in a paper world. He didn't wipe it away. It felt right, somehow, that his skin be in the house too. He was part of it. He always had been. A ghost not of the house, but within it. Sleep became fragmentary. Dreams layered themselves with blue ink and mechanical pencil lines. In one dream, he walked the real house, full size, and heard footsteps just ahead of him in every corridor. He never caught up. He only saw the back of a man, square-shouldered, careful, who vanished each time he turned a corner. In waking hours, Joel no longer spoke to friends. The phone rang unanswered. His groceries rotted. His body withered with the kind of slowness that can only come from dedication, a devotion more sacred than rational. One afternoon, he placed the miniature version of a room called the Untaken Seat. It was an exact replica of the dining room from Joel's childhood, right down to the chipped leg on the fifth chair. He hadn't seen that room in 20 years, yet here it was, reanimated from architectural drawings and some impossible recall. In the center sat a table. On the table, another miniature blueprint, recursive, a house within a house. He leaned in close and read the note beside it. In every plan I made, there was a place for you to walk away. The meaning felt like a slap, not angry, but cold, disarming. A man who never knew how to say stay might build exits into every encounter. His love had a fire code. Every room included escape. Joel wept that night, but not like a child, not loudly, not even cathartically. The tears came like condensation, gradual, unremarked. They fell on the roof of the solarium of disavowed joy and pooled like rain on a place that had never seen sunlight. He hated his father, and he loved him, and he didn't know how to forgive someone who had made himself ungrievable. Each room was a mirror of something that had been missing. Each hallway a path around what should have been said. Joel's pride, quieter, more interior than his father's, had always told him not to need answers. But this house asked otherwise. This house said, "Look again." He did. In a drawer beneath the final blueprint, hidden in a pocket of folded vellum, was one last sketch, a profile of a man, half finished, the face incomplete, standing at the threshold of a door, and beside him, a child, drawn not in lines but in shading, as if always on the verge of fading. In the lower right corner, in faded graphite, "I did not know how to enter the house I built for you." Joel stared until the lines blurred. And for the first time, he understood the house had never been abandoned. It had been waiting for someone to knock. Time stopped working inside the house. Not the real house, the one with peeling paint and wilted blinds, but the model, which by now had eclipsed the size of the dining room table and spilled onto the floor in waves of hallways and tiny empty rooms. Joel had rearranged his entire life around it. The kitchen, once a place for idle lunches and unwatered plants, had become a fabrication studio. The coffee table held only carving tools and ash from incense he couldn't remember lighting. He hadn't opened a window in weeks. The house grew while the world receded. He no longer checked his phone. He stopped replying to emails. His face, once intermittently visible in the cracked bathroom mirror, became a stranger. A man hunched by lamplight, shoulders curled like paper, breath shallow and fragrant with dust and regret. And still he built. Each new room arrived like a memory he hadn't known he'd lost. The chamber of formal departures, a strange vestibule with 5 doors and no hinges, mirrored the quiet dread of childhood mornings, when his father left for work without ever saying goodbye. The gallery of never-displayed works was lined with frames facing inward, like gilt turned decorative. Joel carved each miniature canvas with nothing on them, just spaces meant for things that could never be seen. He began to speak to himself in his father's voice. Not mimicry, possession. He would murmur measurements aloud in the same clipped tone. 7'2" clearance. No more. Illumination, no brighter than 260 lumens. Sometimes, he would say things without realizing he was speaking. Whole sentences about airflow and structural integrity, followed by strange half-prayers. Sentences that felt like hauntings. The walls should narrow just before forgiveness. Was it madness? Possibly. But madness has structure too. The deeper he went into the house, the more it ceased to be a model and became a kind of psychic terrain, not imagined, not metaphorical, but absolute. The boundary between blueprint and memory thinned until Joel couldn't tell whether he was reconstructing something or uncovering it, excavating the artifact of a father-son bond, fossilized in shame. One night, in the dead silence of 3:11 a.m., he crawled into the model itself. Not physically, the scale was far too small, but psychically, the way one inhabits a dream. He stood in the vestibule of consideration. The light was low. The walls pulsed with breath. He walked. Room after room opened before him, impossibly detailed. He smelled chalk, cedar, the breath of old books. The air hummed with the electricity of withheld truths. And then, just before he reached the rotunda of self-negation, he saw a figure seated in a low-backed chair. A man, not old, not young, not fully solid. The lines of his face shimmered like bad reception, but Joel knew it was him, knew in the marrow of his bones. His father. Neither spoke. Words would have shattered the spell. They only looked at each other, two architects of the same ruin. And then Joel noticed the man was holding something, a small object, a wooden scale model of the same house. Inside it, impossibly, was Joel, the miniature version, carving a version of the same room they now stood in. A house within a house within a house, grief stacked like dolls. Joel stepped forward. The figure blurred. Its outlines shook, not with fear but sorrow. Joel reached out, not to touch but to offer. A hand, a gesture, the thing they'd never learned to do. The air between them thickened, trembling like a curtain between worlds. And then the floor fell out. Joel woke on the hardwood, face pressed to the leg of the table. The model intact beside him, his body cold with sweat. His hands were streaked with graphite, and something darker, blood or ink, he wasn't sure. He sat up slowly, disoriented, the echo of that silent meeting pulsing behind his eyes. Had it been a dream, a delusion, or had he, in some impossible sacred way, stepped inside the confession his father had built for him? In the days that followed, he moved less, spoke less, but he saw more. He saw how the house had distorted both of them, how pride had wrapped its tendrils around the man who built it, not as vanity, but as armor, how it had suffocated Joel by inheritance. His father hadn't needed to be right. He had needed to be safe, so he built a fortress too intricate to admit the danger of feeling. Joel, in turn, had become its final wing. He didn't finish the house. Not out of fatigue, not out of loss of faith, he simply understood, one evening, as he sanded the balustrade of a tiny spiral stair, that to complete it would be to entomb it, to seal off a living grief inside a coffin of glue and scale. Some rooms were not meant to be closed, so he stopped mid-construction, just before completing the room of preemptive farewells. He left the walls half-framed, the floorboards unpainted, a deliberate wound, an opening. Instead, he began dismantling, not with rage or ritual, but gently, piece by piece, room by room, as if reversing time or undoing a curse. He plucked out the chamber of unoffered apologies and placed it in a velvet-lined box. The library of recurring questions was folded into parchment and sealed with wax. He did not destroy anything. He only rehoused it. Some rooms he buried in the backyard, beneath the hollow where the magnolia tree had stood before the storm took it. Others he mailed anonymously, the hallway of vanishing encouragement to a cousin he hadn't spoken to since the funeral, the office of unreturned gestures to the university his father once lectured at. A strange kind of absolution, not forgiveness, not vengeance, just release. In the emptied space of his home, Joel began noticing strange light. At dawn, it filtered in soft through the kitchen blinds, catching the dust like golden rainfall. At dusk, it poured in from the west, thick and orange, staining the walls with warmth. The house, his house, the real one, breathed easier, like a chest unburdened. One morning, as autumn curled itself around the town like a closing hand, Joel took the final blueprint, the first one, the one that had arrived in the rusted brass tube, and unfolded it one last time. The paper was soft now, worn thin by oil and memory. He ran his fingers along the lines, not as an architect, but as a son. There, near the bottom right corner, where he'd never looked closely enough before, was a final annotation, scrawled sideways in the smallest hand. If you find me here, let the house be yours, but do not live inside it. He read it again. Do not live inside it. It was not just a directive, it was a blessing, a warning, a plea. The house had been his father's sanctuary, his mausoleum, his prison, a place where pride had learned to speak fluently enough to silence love. But Joel had heard it now, had translated it, brick by imagined brick. He folded the blueprint carefully and placed it in a fire he had prepared with reverence. The paper hissed, curled, then disappeared into smoke and ember. The house finally breathed out. Joel did not weep. There were no final tears, no sweeping catharsis, only the deep, still ache of recognition, the way a wound settles once it's no longer questioned. And in that stillness, a question lingered, soft as the ashes in his palm. How many houses have we built, not to shelter love, but to keep it from finding us?